us going from niche to mass and just going to the high growth of its business cycle.
We are now reacting to PFL now purchasing Bellator.
Underserved.
We're going
it's
to
just
go
starting its
into
monetization.
in a little bit and get some details.
So that's what I saw.
Here's Mr.
And
Davis,
so I don't
the
do anything
owner
else
of
for 7 years.
No other businesses?
I don't do boo.
Okay.
Now, after a year, I left my own venture capital firm, of which people thought I was insane. Okay?
Why did you do that?
You can't build anything. It's too hard unless you're all in. So I have a great team, Peter Murray, CEO, and Ray Sefo, George Greenberg, fantastic team. But having built several companies before, there's an art to doing it. And I didn't think it would maximize unless I went all in doing it. But my partner said, hold on, we're quote at the top of the food chain, handing out money. So you're a chooser, and now you're going to be a beggar, of which I've called 1,000 people asking for money, over 5 years.
How hard is that, by the way?
Well, if you really believe in what you're doing, it's only medium hard.
Okay.
But, like in the Wall Street Journal, they say 100 people turn me down. And I go, well, when you get to 1,000, call me. But if you really believe in it, you love the challenge. It's almost like the bodybuilders when you see them lift all that weight and you go, man, I couldn't do that. Or my friend Carlos Silva, who used to work there, he just ran a huge Ironman. How did he do that yesterday? I couldn't do that. If you love it, the pain is worth it. If you love it, the pain is worth it. So for me, the short answer to answering your question, from a little idea in my head that one Monday to today.
Yeah, so in other words, in the end of it, Davis says that it's worth it. While, by the way, I'm rocking the old school Reebok UFC gear from back in 2015 when they started sponsoring UFC. If you remember, a lot of the fighters during that time, they were not happy with the fact that they weren't able to garner any sponsorships. They just had to wear these uniform shorts, and then that was it. I remember seeing this as far back as 2013 when some UFC insiders were claiming that they were going to do some sort of uniform style to somehow make the league and the UFC look a lot more legit. Well, now, a couple of years later, here we are. The UFC is considered a monopoly, and now they could face potential competition with the PFL now buying Bellator. So, a little bit of some reaction and also a little bit of some recap of what it is that Davis said in this Ariel Helwani interview. Shout outs to MMA Fighting at the MMA Hour. So he basically said they're going to keep the Bellator. They're going to have PFL in terms of their continuous tournament structure, but they're also going to have a super fight series for Bellator where they have both Bellator and PFL fighters fight, and they're also going to allow PFL fighters to participate and Bellator fighters to also participate in the PFL tournament if they wish. So this is very interesting in these dynamics and these combinations that they want to put together between the PFL and Bellator to sort of give a bit of their unique look and not really eliminate it from its company at any extent. If you remember when the UFC bought Pride, what happened? They got rid of Pride. You're not going to fight in a boxing ring because, as you know, Japanese MMA and Pride FC in particular, they fight in a boxing ring, not in a cage or in a ring that has ropes, whatever you want to call it, boxing ring, Muay Thai ring. It's a ring that has ropes. That's not a cage. So they can't do a product like that. Now, they also said that the reason why they don't do elbows in the PFL is because, guess what? They have a tournament format. They want to be able to allow guys to fight continuously without getting damaged or hurt. And this is the reason why they do that. As opposed to the Bellator Super Fight Series, what are they going to do? Well, this is exactly what they're going to do. They're going to keep it as is, but they're going to have a limited amount of pay-per-views all throughout the years. And we'll also have pay-per-views for the PFL. So, now that I've gone on for 5 minutes, well, 2 of those minutes were with live audio of Davis right now talking to Ariel Helwani. As we're still speaking, he's still talking to him right now. But a good 3 minutes of explanations towards this venture that PFL has now gotten themselves into by purchasing Bellator. I explained what they're going to do, how they're going to set up the matches, and how they're going to separate the two brands. Now, what can you compare this to in terms of some things that you've seen in the past? Now, you've probably seen this in professional wrestling, and even Ariel Helwani has mentioned this on the MMA Hour. When the WWE bought WCW, what did they do? Did they separate the brands? Did they continue having Monday Nitro shows? Of course not. So what they did was they added WCW into the storyline and created this, well, how do I say this, invasion angle of some sort. Now, with the PFL, you could sort of do the same thing. You can have PFL guys taking on Bellator guys, but eventually, all these guys just become one particular company. If you remember, Luke Rockhold was a Strikeforce champion when he walked into the UFC. The same with, among other names that were in the UFC, Jacare was in Strikeforce, and then he got into the UFC, was a top contender. In the WEC, Anthony Pettis was the last WEC champion of all time, right? He beat Ben Henderson, and then eventually Ben Henderson became a world champion himself at 155. And a lot of these WEC guys became a main staple in the 155 division of the UFC, because if you remember, WEC's emphasis back then was on the lower weight classes, which is why the likes of Uriah Faber, our hometown hero right here in Sacramento, was a big instrumental part in that particular league, and also some of the names and the people that he brought up along the way, like Chad Mendez, Benavidez, if you guys remember, Joseph Benavidez, he was a big staple in the WEC. And then eventually these guys went into the UFC and became their main staple and basically assimilated themselves into that company without really distinguishing them as a WEC fighter, a Strikeforce fighter, or maybe even as a Dream fighter from Dream FC in Japan, which was the quintessential predecessor of Pride FC and among other leagues in that part of the world. So a whole lot of exciting things going on in this particular aspect of the PFL. And if you remember also, well, Francis Ngannou and Jake Paul are signed to the PFL. So now they have super fights along the way. They have another venue to somehow challenge the UFC in terms of pay-per-views, but obviously that's going to be a long stretch, because let's face it, the UFC is a known brand, and by God, I got to tell you, that is a very important aspect of business. For example, if you're going to get into the toothpaste business, well, who is the main product that you buy from? What name comes to mind? Crest? Now, I got to tell you, if you go to Trader Joe's, or if you go to any of these healthy lifestyle type of places, you're going to have different types of toothbrushes, right? You're going to have toothbrushes that are good, maybe even better. But the bottom line is Crest, and when it comes to toothpastes, they just have a name that, well, you just really can't compete with. That's kind of where the UFC is at the current moment in time. You know what I mean? So because of that, I gotta tell you, I gotta hold. Hey guys, I'm filming my podcast. Say what's up to Kyrie Abu El-Kheer MMA.
Hello! Hey, yo, what's good?
There it is, right? So you never know what I'm going to be doing while I'm filming these podcasts. So, yeah, so back to the PFL and Bellator, right? So here's a couple of things you got to understand, okay? By the way, I always like highlighting some really happy people. They look really happy. They just were jamming and whatnot. I figured I'd just throw that in there. So you never know what you're going to get in this channel, just like the PFL never knew what they were going to get with Jake Paul and Francis Ngannou. So what I was saying was that there's some things that are a known product. That's something that the PFL comes to grips with and understands that, you know what, this is exactly what they do. They are the top name of the company when it comes to pay-per-views. But they are giving options to the audience, and that is important to understand. It is very important for the audience to understand that they are going to offer something completely different. Obviously, Jake Paul fighting, that's completely different than what the UFC is doing. Francis Ngannou, who is the lineal heavyweight champion of the UFC, now coming into that league, it's a great look. And then another thing, the fact that he went 10 rounds with the Gypsy King, the top boxer of the heavyweight division in the current moment of time, that's great for their product. You can't deny them of any of these things. They are on top of the fact that they have all these other top names in their roster. I think it's only going up for their revenue, and it's only going up for their reputation. And quite frankly, I got to be honest with you, the UFC needs a little bit of some competition. Now, you also got to think about there's a class action lawsuit going on with the UFC, right? And how will that change the landscape of MMA? A couple of things. For one, the contracts that the UFC fighters are going to get if, let's say, this lawsuit comes through, you're going to get a situation where these contracts are going to be limited. No long-term contracts. There's no ironclad or anything like that. You do 2 to 3 fights, and then you're out, and then you're going to another company that's going to offer you more money. And then you can probably take championships along the way. Maybe you can even unify championships in between the leagues, but you never know. The point of the matter is that we are creating options with the PFL and Bellator. And some of the things that they have going on, I think, is quite brilliant, considering that, well, they are the B League compared to the UFC. Let's just call it what it is, right? Now, I know they don't like to somehow admit that. They don't like to admit that the UFC is the A team and they are the B team, and they somehow want to believe that there's some equality in that, but there isn't, because the UFC's name is synonymous with MMA, and when they bought it back in 1993, no, I'm sorry, not 1993, in 2001, obviously they started in 1993, but the current regime with Dana White in company, and when they bought it, well, the names and the letters were synonymous with Valet Judo, bare knuckle fighting, no holds barred, all these names that originally were somehow tied to freestyle fighting in any way. The UFC owns that. Now you have the PFL, you call it the Professional Fighters League. Anybody could easily mistake that for a kickboxing league, for a boxing league. Bellator, you call it Bellator, what exactly